Welcome to the second season of the Ecologies of Danger podcast. Ecologies of Danger is a project produced by the students of a course on environmental security at Colgate University. In this season, we look at the different ways in which the environment has become a security issue. In this episode, Rob Sobelson explains what New York's Hurricane Sandy can teach us about how cities prepare for disaster.
The date is October 26, 2012, and Governor Andrew Cuomo has just declared a state of emergency in New York. One day later, Governor Chris Christie follows suit and declares a state of emergency in New Jersey. 2 days later, on October 29th, Hurricane Sandy makes landfall on the east coast of the U.S.
If you don't evacuate, you're not just putting your own life in danger, you are also endangering the lives of our first responders who may have to come in and rescue you.
Mayor Bloomberg echoes his peers' urgency following the issued state of emergency. 375,000 people were ordered to evacuate from areas prone to flooding in New York City alone. In preparation for the natural disaster, New York City began a massive system shutdown, seen by the closing of the MTA and school cancellations. Natural weather events have always occurred in New York, so what warranted such a large governmental response to these weather reports? Well, hurricanes are not a new concept to the U.S., but the frequency and intensity of storms has increased with global warming. Hurricane Sandy shocked the world with its immense damage to one of the world's most famous and powerful cities. When reflecting on the damage caused, we can see the disproportionate effect of 21st century superstorms on poor communities of color. Making cities more resilient to climate change in response to these storms is not only practical, but a matter of environmental justice. Superstorm Sandy exposed the environmental racism in New York City. The disproportionate effect on minority populations following Sandy can be explained through the major shift from rural areas to urban areas. Coincidentally, poorer populations that are predominantly people of color moved into more vulnerable locations in New York City. This increased vulnerability hinders resiliency, or a community's ability to rebound and adapt after a disaster. The disproportionate effect on these populations makes it increasingly difficult for rebound. After the state of emergency had been called, governmental agencies and media outlets began instructing residents to evacuate in preparation for the storm.
716 Rockaway Street. 716 Rockaway Street. 4 people trapped in the house.
The days just following Sandy were those of a third world country.
Carol Middlesdorf, an Ocean Breeze resident, shows us the damage that followed the storm. In this vulnerable community, the failed evacuation highlights a systematic structural problem that occurred throughout New York City during the storm. What drove this lack of preparedness when warnings were broadcasted days in advance? A NASA report on vulnerability highlights the failures in communication, primarily to non-English speakers and residents in high-rise apartment buildings during Sandy. This analysis can help explain why people of color were not as prepared and failed to evacuate before the superstorm made landfall. But this does not explain everything. Data on post-traumatic stress and depression illustrated some significant trends. Spatial clustering, specifically the grouping of minority populations, could be seen all over the 5 boroughs when viewing these results. Additionally, these clusters of minority communities had significantly higher associated stress and depression than Caucasian populations. These post-traumatic results tell us important information regarding resiliency of poor and people of color populations. Is it just by chance that these poor minority populations are impacted more, or is there a larger issue at hand? Environmental justice seeks to answer this question. The trends in depression and post-traumatic stress can be tied back to the state's failed preparedness. Another analysis broke New York City into 2 distinct zones: vulnerable to flooding and not vulnerable. The project worked to improve old vulnerability assessments that had used outdated data. The results gathered from the new mapping project were disturbing and also spatially distributed.
And we found that 9,500 buildings were outside the old zones and inside the new preliminary maps, which were just released this year, that were damaged in Sandy. So these are people that may have raised their house 1 or 2 feet, may realize that they might have some flooding, but they weren't prepared for a 11-foot storm surge in their backyard.
Theo Meyer explains this failed preparedness. As a reporter for WNYC News, he discusses how much of the evacuation plans involved outdated information. Using the newly gathered information, 9,500 buildings would have been highlighted as vulnerable to storm damage. This misinformation disproportionately impacts poor communities of color and their resiliency efforts. Is it fair to hold these communities responsible during recovery if the information related to them was incorrect? Before resiliency and recovery can occur, advocacy towards policy change must happen fast. Are the poor minority populations responsible for these elevated rates of depression and stress? I don't think so. The underlying theme here is governmental failures. Primarily, advocacy towards policy changes should first appear on a communal level. This can lubricate more powerful changes seen on the governmental level. On a local level, City Councilman Charlie Rooney recounts his experience with the preparation before the storm.
We've been through our share of nor'easters, and most of the time they do go out to sea. This one did not.
Are local governments responsible for the damage caused? Well, responsibility can once again be passed along to the federal government. After all, it was FEMA that had failed to update flood-prone maps. Hindsight will always be 20/20, and in understanding resilience, we must work towards policy change for the future in relation to communities and the local and federal governments. Urban resilience and long-term recovery depends on adaptability. Much of the federal aid actually promoted status quo rebuilding, which does little in response to future natural disasters. A year after Sandy hit New York City, Luther Houston, a resident in a largely minority housing project, talks about the lingering issues.
We couldn't really go downstairs because I'm an asthmatic and I'm a diabetic. So for me to keep going up and down, it was hard. And it's still going on. It's not like if everything was back to normal, we running on a generator.
Resiliency must shake up the status quo. In response to the failures leading up to Sandy's destruction, appropriate resource usage, increased awareness and knowledge, and technological improvements will lead to resiliency. Resource availability to poor and minority populations would also aid resilience, as seen through a study that identified their ability to cope based on whether they had access to strong community networks and institutions. Failures of Sandy also resulted from inappropriate land use. This failure in the urban planning stage should serve as a learning lesson for long-term recovery projects. Resilience efforts will ultimately help reduce the environmental injustices exposed by Sandy. In tackling urbanization and high population densities, governments are inadvertently helping reduce social inequality. Moving forwards, how can we prevent vulnerability in an increasingly urbanized world? Well, we can start at the urban planning stage. Much of the vulnerabilities relating to Sandy directly resulted from property developments in at-risk neighborhoods. Policy changes can help pave the way towards reducing the risks associated with waterfront properties. In cities that already exist, steps such as the construction of seawalls, bulkheads, and levees can help reduce the damages caused from hurricanes. Finally, reductions in social inequality can help reduce the environmental injustices that can be seen following natural disasters. By no means are these suggestions intended to be overnight solutions. Rather, the implementation of these over time will drive the adaptability and resilience of cities. Hurricane Katrina occurred 7 years prior to Hurricane Sandy, with many similar thematic injustices and failed preparations. A proactive approach aided by policy changes at all levels of government will reduce the destruction of future storms. As the 21st century sees an increase in the severity and frequency of storms, environmental justice must be addressed now before the next storm hits. For Colgate University, I am Robert Sobelson.